President Trump says America shouldn't lecture other countries on their own domestic affairs. Some say he's empowering dictators. Others say at last America is minding its own business. When it comes to human rights, democracy, and religious tolerance, who has the moral authority? Are there universal norms, or does every country get to decide for itself? Hello, I'm Carol Pinault. Welcome to our special series, Africa and the Trump Administration. Throughout its history, the U.S. has claimed American exceptionalism, born of a new nation that believed in democracy and an egalitarian view of liberty and justice for all. At the end of the Second World War, and again after the Cold War, Americans claimed its strength came from moral authority, and that it had the right, even the obligation, to hold countries to international norms. Throughout Africa, many have questioned America's uneven implementation of moral authority and whether any country should even have the power to set moral standards for others. And yet, for advocates and those who were oppressed, America was where they turned for help, validation, and the power of moral authority. Today, President Trump says the U.S. shouldn't lecture other countries. He's praised leaders accused of human rights abuses, corruption, and assaults on freedom of speech. In Africa, officials committed to good governance and advocates for issues such as human rights, democracy, transparency, tolerance. Today, they fear that U.S. actions are emboldening dictators. But with America first and a more transactional style of international affairs, has the U.S. ceded this global role? We have a great panel with us today. We have Ambassador Herman Cohen, former Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, Amira Woods, Associate Fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies, and Grant Harris, former Special Assistant to President Obama and Senior Director for African Affairs at the White House. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
So, Grant, if I can start with you. It seems that this White House has really looked at America's role in the world and this moral authority very differently. How do you see things changing from when you were in the White House just a few months ago?
I think it's definitely a different outlook on the world. And as we talk about its impact on Africa, U.S. policy consistently has really put governance at the top of the list, along with peace and security issues and economic development. And I think we're seeing governance issues deprioritized, going to lesser focus on human rights, lesser focus on press freedom, lesser focus on anti-corruption. And I think that we'll pay a cost as we talk about our role as our relationships and also the type of partners that we choose to work with.
Do you see that the Africans are looking to the U.S. for moral authority?
Many countries around the world do look to the U.S. for the example that it sets. But we need leaders in every country, in and outside of government, to really be performing and putting their citizens first.
Ambassador Cohen, you have really the long view. You have been at this for a very long time.
Right.
How do you see this kind of ebb and flow? Because there really have been different levels that administrations have engaged in this.
Well, I think it's a little too early in the Trump administration to reach a judgment as to their policy. I noticed that in the Congo, the Trump administration just increased sanctions against people close to President Kabila, which is the same thing that President Obama did. So it doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be a big change. It depends on what our interests are.
You have certainly been passionate about so many of these issues. How does it feel as you hear America talk very differently?
Well, to be quite frank, we have to say there has not been much change. I think if you look historically at how the U.S. has engaged with Africa, it has been through a lens that is quite transactional. You know, a lens that sees the resources of Africa, particularly oil, gas, mining, increasingly land and access to arable land as assets that the U.S. business interests are interested in. And so, it's been transactional over time. And some say it's not only recent time, but since the days of the slave trade, it's been transactional. So I think it has reinforced attention to the transactional nature with the Trump administration, but many see this as continuation of what's been in place for quite some time.
I don't think that we can take that simplistic of a view. Looking at the president's emergency plan for AIDS relief, it saved 750,000 lives over 4 years. And looking at the development investments, looking at over 50 years of time, you've got massive investment in trying to build economic development and growth. And so I think it is nuanced. For every country, there's a transactional element to foreign policy and advancing national interest. But in Africa, I think the U.S. has very deep ties that go beyond that.
So, Grant, I would love to say I agree with you, but unfortunately I don't, right? If we had an economic model supported by the U.S. that said, let's add value to those resources in the country, we would not need the essential pittance that's come from aid, right? Because essentially what has flowed out has been far more than what has flowed in terms of aid, right?
That may be, right.
So the transactional nature has been there, many say for centuries, but clearly
But I don't think it causes that
times.
conclusion. You're trying to land at the doorstep of U.S.-Africa policy, larger economic issues, larger global issues. And so I think U.S.-Africa relations are much deeper than a transactional nature.
Clearly, but we can't only look at U.S. bilateral foreign policy. We've got to look at the U.S. as a global leader in setting economic policy that has impacted the continent. I don't think you can divorce one from the other.
Ambassador Cohen, it seems to me AGOA is really a lot of what you're saying. You know, here was this great trade act that was supposed to do so much, and yet it's been dominated by oil.
That's right. Well, I think the problem of the absence of value added is not due to U.S. policy or World Bank policy. It's due to the fact that African governments have not created the environment for private sector to invest. I remember, you know, I go way back, and I remember when I was in the Congo, in Kinshasa, there were a lot of U.S. investments. You know, Goodyear was doing tires. French companies were building Peugeots and that sort of thing. There were big textile factories right there in Kinshasa of Belgian investors, and it all disappeared. Why? Instability, a bad environment. So this created a type of situation where foreign investors, and even more important, domestic investors were not investing.
Unprecedented. It's a word often used to describe the Trump presidency. Critics point to his actions and ask whether the U.S. still holds itself to a strong moral standard. Consider this. President Trump has called for an immigration ban from several Muslim-majority countries. He says the U.S. should resume the use of torture, including waterboarding and a lot worse. His daughter and son-in-law, both with no previous government experience, now hold top advisor positions in the White House. Critics point to the emoluments clause in the U.S. Constitution and say the president is using his position to enrich himself and his family. In the midst of an investigation into whether campaign and White House staff had improper dealings with Russia, he fired the director of the FBI. African ambassadors in Washington ask, if our leaders did those things, do you know what you would say to us? Or as one Obama advisor noted, African leaders may be less likely to look to American governance and human rights as something to be respected. Grant, I think you know that quote. It comes from you.
That's right. I think that the United States right now is hypocritical in some key areas, including mixing business with the presidency, not having separation of institutions. And if I've been in the U.S. government issuing statements against similar behavior of many of the examples that you listed. And so I think as we go back to the topic of moral authority, there's much that is lost when we're not leading by example and we're not staying principled. But I'm deeply concerned, frankly, by the way the civil service has been treated, by the outpouring of very qualified foreign service officers, of civil servants across many departments and institutions. And I think that that will cause lasting damage to U.S. institutions and our capacity to engage and to have deep relationships abroad.
You know, Ambassador Cohen, you were also in the position of talking to governments about their own actions and how America saw these things. How do you see our being able to do that with what we're doing in our own house?
Well, I'm quite worried. Just to give you an example, when the appellate court here ruled against President Trump on his travel ban that you mentioned, what was President Trump's reaction? That so-called judge. By contrast, in South Africa, when the courts ruled against President Zuma, he accepted it. The strong institutions in South Africa are a lesson to us now, I think.
When you talk to Africans, are they concerned that if this is the way America is dealing with it in its own country, is anyone going to be watching out for what African governments are doing?
Well, it's really funny. We have to look at our comedians. And Trevor Noah has this great skit that's comparing Trump with Mobutu's and the others. And you just, word for word, you realize that it's scary, the similarities. We've got to look at the reality of who's in place around President Trump. And it is worrisome, the role of the generals. I don't think we've had a U.S. administration with so many generals in decision-making. I think it sets a standard that's worrisome, not just for the U.S., but for the rest of the world as well.
Do you worry about things like corruption being on the rise? And, do you think there's a way to bring this genie back in the bottle?
I think our institutions are under severe strain, and I think that we've lost a lot of pride internationally in how we carry ourselves and in the example that we set. And no country is entirely 100% consistent in its views or in its foreign policy. And I think that what we're seeing right now is really testing these principles and these values. I'm hopeful that our institutions will remain strong and will provide a check, that they won't allow these deep cuts that have been proposed in development in our diplomatic corps, that they won't allow a rollback of these relationships and these policies. But time will tell. I think that there's a laugh test, which is if we've criticized other presidents and other governments for this type of behavior, why would we tolerate it here? And I think we need to hold ourselves to these standards.
Ambassador Cohen, as far as these cuts to state, do you think that will have an impact then, combined with these kinds of things, and then the cuts, will that make it even harder?
If the cuts go through, but when you cut money, you have to close embassies. And when you close an embassy, it's not just the State Department that disappears from that country. You have the intelligence agencies, the military attachés, the Commerce Department, agriculture. So your whole U.S. government is not being represented. And the members of Congress understand that. So I'm optimistic that Congress will not allow these deep cuts to our programs in Africa.
Well, I think I'm hopeful that your optimism is well placed, but I'm worried that the trade-offs right now, what we see is a very push towards particularly increased military trade and sales of military hardware, which could create even further instability throughout the continent. I think that's the worry.
In your conversations with leaders throughout Africa, do you sense anything from leaders that are perhaps more in the side of dictatorial realm? Are any of them saying, great, that's a sigh of relief, I'll be able to do what I want?
Yes, well, the country that I follow the most closely is the Democratic Republic of Congo because of my history. And I know for a fact that when President Trump's victory was assured, President Kabila had a big party because he's assuming that the pressure that President Obama had to democratize, have a free and fair election, will go away. I think he's going to be disappointed.
I hope so in that case, but I think one of the fundamental tensions that we're drawing out is how the U.S. sees itself in the world. And I worry as we talk about U.S.-Africa relations that this administration will view the continent through the straw of counterterrorism, and that security tools will be in the lead, and that we will look past the broader economic context, the development context, the need for jobs and opportunities and good governance and rule of law to prevent, even in the counterterrorist realm, opportunities for youth to be so disaffected that they might be radicalized. And other countries will step in. China, Brazil, Turkey, Russia, others will gladly step into this space if we retrench and if we pull back on our relationships.
When it comes to Africa, the U.S. has not always been on the right side of every fight. During the Cold War, corruption was allowed to fester, unchecked for decades, just as long as the dictator was anti-communist. After World War II, African nationalist movements demanded independence. But the U.S. didn't always defend democracy. Instead, it often sided with its European allies, the colonial oppressors. And of course, there is what is perhaps the greatest stain on America's moral authority: slavery. It's often said that the victors write history, but it doesn't make that history right. Could the same be said for moral authority? So, Ambassador Cohen, we've always presented ourselves as having moral authority, but that doesn't mean we've always had it.
Well, that's an interesting question. I've been just reading some documents of President Eisenhower. You know, he was president when all these countries became independent. And there was a big argument within the Secretary of State was saying Cold War is what matters. But then the Vice President of the United States, who had traveled in Africa, said no. They want to be independent. They don't want to join with one faction or another, one great power or another. We have to support their independence. This was Richard Nixon.
Really?
Yes. And Eisenhower.
Surprised, did you know that?
No.
Yeah, and Eisenhower said, I side with the vice president. He said, we must appeal to their hearts and minds, and we must have economic development. And my argument is that this has been consistent in our policy throughout, since independence days.
I think the reality on the ground is that the U.S. has undermined the liberation of the continent really since the days of colonialism. If you look at South Africa, you know, where the U.S. supported apartheid, supported minority rule in the midst of the human horrors that were going on in South Africa.
I disagree with that. Ronald Reagan got the Cubans out of Angola, got Namibia to be a free country from apartheid, and sanctions, U.S. sanctions against South Africa under Ronald Reagan caused the South African to end apartheid.
I think the record across the board is consistent, where the U.S. has not been on the side of liberation and justice.
That's really reductionist and looks past a lot of investments in economic development and also sanctions against those committing human rights abuses. We've been talking about that. I don't think we could say it's all black or all white.
Previously, we had always had this hierarchical relationship with Africa. And then under Clinton, it started where he said, let's have partnerships. And a partner doesn't tell another partner, this is how you'll behave. Right? And so it became increasingly, under the Bush administration and then the Obama administration, of really focusing on an even playing field in partnerships. Is that a fair assessment?
I think that is a fair assessment. And partnership means that it's not a, this is how you do things. It's a conversation about the mutual goals that we're trying to achieve. The United States is trying to advance its foreign policy like any other country, and you're trying to advance governance and human rights, and you're trying to advance security, and partners can be good on one, bad on the other, and that means that it's nuanced. For many outsiders, there's a tendency to look only through one lens or to see one issue as paramount, but the United States doesn't have the luxury to do that.
President Trump has said that he now wants to deal with everybody. This is something that you and I have talked about, that, you know, dealing with everybody inside of the tent.
That's right. When I was a junior diplomat in Kinshasa, we had Mobutu, very difficult guy, very corrupt dictator. They exist, we have to deal with them, we may hate them, but there are always ways of having relations with these countries. And we should never not have relations.
Well, Ambassador, I feel like that's the perfect example when you bring up Mobutu, because clearly, you know, Patrice Lumumba, he was killed with the U.S. and the U.K. complicit in that, right? The historical record is now open and clear. And Mobutu was put in place, right? And so it's not just that they exist. And this is why the question of moral authority is such a good one, right? You know, it's almost as if it was a deliberate effort to take away the power and the real moral authority of people within those countries to choose their leaders freely, to hold those leaders accountable. And that is what I say, that the moral authority has been lost at those critical times. And
I disagree with a lot of that. Mobutu was not 100% bad. And having worked with him, I think, was not a sin. And to say that we undermined the great visionary leaders like Nkrumah, it was not the United States that did that. We were working with Nkrumah. We have done very well, I think, with African leaders, and to the extent that things have not gone well, I think comes from internal reasons, not from the United States.
But in looking at the Cold War, are you at all concerned with the things that are happening with Russia now, the new scramble for Africa? It will be about geopolitics instead of about what's really happening with Africans.
I am very concerned about U.S. influence vis-a-vis China and Russia and other countries that present a different model and are looking for relationships in Africa to advance their own global goals. And if you look, for instance, at the United Nations and many international fora, African states are the largest bloc. They're increasingly coordinated in terms of their views. And China's deep relationships, China, by the way, makes more than $50 billion a year off of its infrastructure investments. That's feeding a lot of jobs in China that I would rather feed jobs here. But also you see in some of the UN vote records, China has escaped censure on some human rights resolutions solely because of African votes. And it's because you've got economic relationships that are being deepened by China in particular. Those correspond as well to deepened political relationships, deepened military relationships. And that affects not just where the job growth is, but the United States' role in the world and our other foreign policy goals too.
You really don't have moral authority if you're not in the game.
Right.
No one's listening to you.
Right. Moral authority is a complex subject. A lot of people, everyday citizens, look to the United States for what the United States stands for. And I think now we're really being tested in terms of the example we're setting.
Let's take some questions from our viewers. Daniel from Accra, Ghana writes, I am proud to be African, and I believe we've had good leaders such as Nelson Mandela and Kwame Nkrumah. So why do we tend to look at American leaders for moral authority? So, Amira, what do you say to that?
I say hear to Daniel. I think he is right on point. He comes from Ghana, which is one of the countries on the continent that has strengthened its institutions, that has both in terms of its handover of the democratic process, series of elections lately that have shown us that, the Ghanaians know how to do this well. And I think it's because of that we have to say, it's not only the political leadership of Ghana, but in many countries around the continent where you see emerging new leaders that are looking for the interests of their people and putting the interests of their people first. I think beyond the formal political leadership, we also have civil society, social movements that are vibrant, dynamic, and growing on the continent. And you see new leadership, Africans Rising for Justice, Peace, and Dignity is one of those new formations on the continent that is driven by young people using technology in new and interesting ways. And so I think this notion of leadership, both the formal political leadership and the non-formal, the social movement leadership, I think it's growing in dynamic ways that will benefit the continent and the world.
Alexa in Alexandria, Virginia asks, why should Africans look to the Trump administration for moral authority when so many cases of corruption and human rights topics, such as women's issues and immigration, are being demeaned in every day in this country? So, Grant, this gets back to what we talked about earlier, your quote that Africans, they look at this and say, how do we respect this?
I think that the United States, we need to make sure that our institutions withstand these challenges first and foremost. But I think it's also incumbent upon people around the world to not just look to the United States, but to try to look to their own leaders, look to try to build civil society, build voices. From the United States standpoint, though, I really want us to be in the lead for these values that we've held dear. We're at a difficult time right now, I think. I disagree with the president's priorities as stated in terms of the budget, as stated in terms of how he comports himself with respect to mixing business with the presidency. And I think that sets a really bad example, and it's not consistent with where we've been trying to push African governments and other governments to really go. And I think that we've got some challenges ahead.
And the immigration ban especially, I look at how it must feel for African immigrants here.
Right, I think
who are citizens here.
I think the immigration ban is impossible to justify.
I think there's a lot more than just Trump's attitude. Look at U.S. business in Africa. They have a very good reputation, and that provides moral authority. Africans see the American private sector as really being fair and helping them to advance. So I think that's going to overcome any of the negatives of the Trump administration.
So, Ambassador Cohen, I wish that were the case. We've got to look at the record across the board of how those companies are operating.
U.S. labor record is exemplary.
Industries.
And last, Kay in Manassas, Virginia asks, what can Africa do to release the grip of America as their moral authority? How can Africans begin to see themselves as their own moral authority? Ambassador Cohen, you've worked with so many African governments, and particularly the ones that don't necessarily accept the American moral authority, that are really very strong in saying, we'll have our own.
I think that's absolutely important to have their own moral authority. So it is time for Africans to have their own moral authority. And there are some African leaders that I admire on that. For example, Macky Sall in Senegal, he's bringing moral authority. Unfortunately, Jacob Zuma in South Africa is doing the opposite, you see. But I think slowly but surely, the Africans are coming into their own and will not need the United States anymore, and that's healthy.
And I would say Macky Sall came to power because of young people, Yanamar, the social movement, hip-hop artists, right? That took to the streets, demanded a change, demanded respect for democracy and the rule of law. Similar situation in Burkina. DR Congo has also a vibrant social movement led by young people that's demanding change. If you look at issues of the environmental justice movement, a lot of that moral authority coming both from civil society, environmental justice activists, and from governments on the continent that led to the Paris Climate Agreement. So the moral authority is actually, I think, on the continent.
All right. Thank you so much to my guests, Ambassador Hank Cohen, Amira Woods, and Grant Harris. To our viewers in Africa, America, and around the world, thank you so much for joining us. We'd love to hear from you with thoughts on this program and comments and questions on upcoming topics. We want this series to create a respectful but robust debate on U.S.-Africa relations under this new administration. Be sure to visit us online, friend us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter to make sure your voice is heard. We hope you've enjoyed the program and that you'll continue to tune in for our entire series on Africa and the Trump administration.